Hello everyone and welcome to the last week of Human Rights Norms. In this week we're going to be looking at the environment and human rights, in particular the right to a clean and healthy environment, and then covering a couple of important issues and case studies about that, particular Indigenous groups and climate change. But in this first section we're looking at the history of the environment movement, in particular why there's a social and political and kind of legal movement started to protect the environment. In terms of the long history, the support of the environment hasn't been around forever. The environment and nature has been something which is seen as a threat, something which needs to be controlled or tamed. And so the idea of like the jungle as being somewhere kind of scary has been around for a while, but these kinds of ideas started to change, particularly with the Enlightenment, when there's a move back towards the idea of nature being good. But especially we see it strong in the Romantic movement. You may have heard about the poetry of Wordsworth and Shelley and John Keats. John Keats, I'm not sure if that's his name, but the poetry of, but this kind of romantic poetry which talks about the beauty of nature. And this time in kind of the 1800s, there was a movement back to seeing the nature as something beautiful and something which needs protection. This occurs a bit because it was also a reaction against all the pollution that was occurring during industrialization. When you had these factory cities and their coal burning energy production and all the smog and the pollution that it put out was a concern. And so you did get lots of protests, mainly, well, not lots of protests, but there were protests, mainly in England, but it had spread to Europe and also America. These weren't really much more than just social movements or protests. They weren't organized into an idea that the environment needed to be protected. Now, one way in which it starts being protected, which comes a bit later, is in the formation of national parks. So you get the first national parks in America, but this then spread quite rapidly around the world. So the first national park is Yellowstone. And then we get national parks in England and throughout Europe. And then kind of post-World War II, they start appearing, or even pre-World War II, they start appearing in Asia as well. The idea that we need to kind of protect the environment. Now, in terms of the social movement, it's quite curious that we get, like some of the early social movements come out of Germany. And this is at the time of both the kind of the Weimar, the kind of the more liberal period in Germany in the 20s and 30s, but also kind of went into the Nazi period as well. What was called Lebensreform or life reform. And this idea is that people had to lead healthy lives. It kind of fits into the Aryan, the myth of Aryan superiority. But it had some kind of quite curious, what we may see as unusual aspects. So this is when nudism started, the idea of naturalism. It's good to go to nature and take off your clothes because it's healthy. And so it was a big thing in Germany, even amongst some of the Nazi party. Vegetarianism was also quite strong as well. Adolf Hitler was a vegetarian. And also the kind of the rise of organic food. This mainly came a bit later. But these ideas then were the ones that popped up later in the hippie movement, quite different politically and a whole different story. We see the first vegetarian restaurants in California in the 1960s and 70s, the rise of organic and whole foods as well, and the kind of return to naturalism. And this is all like in the hippie movement as well. And we see this in this collection of photos. So in the top left-hand corner, this is a kind of a typical Lebensreform picture of people out in nature, being healthy. And then below that was a vegetarian cookbook, which I think may have been the first vegetarian cookbook, which is in Germany. And then we see a poster for Yellowstone National Park, which would have been in the 1960s or 70s, maybe a bit later. But national parks start appearing across America at that time. So that's a kind of prehistory, but the really big time in terms of the environment movement is the 1960s and 70s. And it occurs for a couple of reasons. Now, one reason is that in the 1970s, we get the first oil crisis. And this is more of a kind of a political event where, because of the Six-Day War and politics, that the oil supply out of the Middle East gets cut. And many countries suddenly find they don't have enough oil. So that picture at the bottom right there is that, cars couldn't get gas and industries were brought to a standstill. And this really affected deeply countries like Japan and America. And it kind of then made them change their economy away from such heavy industry, heavy energy intensive manufacturing, particularly from Japan. It moved into kind of electronics and things like that. But it was the first time that people in the world suddenly realized that these resources are finite. Oil will run out one day and we need to start conserving that. So there was kind of changes in ideas of consumption. We also get the hippies there as well, as I mentioned before. So the 1960s and 70s, this rise of the social movement, which kind of said that the environment was important, as was environmental protection and eating healthy and things like that. And the kind of ideas that they had then, which were quite radical, are now quite mainstream. The idea of healthy food and healthy eating and so on. Now, another important one was this photo, which we'll look at. So this photo was taken on an Apollo mission to the moon. It wasn't the one where they landed on the moon, I don't think. But when they were kind of, the rocket was going to the moon, they turned back and they took this photo of the Earth. And this is the very first time the Earth had been photographed, because no one had been out into space like that. And when people began to see the Earth like this and see it as this kind of little blue disc in space, suddenly it made people think differently about the world. And they saw it as a kind of a natural phenomenon, the blue of the sea and the whites of the cloud and the brown of the land. It wasn't like territorial, it wasn't based on countries. They also saw that it was kind of fragile, like the Earth is it. You know, if we have trouble with this Earth, there's nowhere else to go. And so this photo has also been said to be one of the reasons to kind of start the thinking about we need to take more care of our environment. We live in this environment, this is all we've got, and we need to be much more careful about it. Now, the other important things, of course, were the pollution concerns. So I mentioned some of these in the last class on business, but a couple of important ones that we see was we had the Minamata Bay mercury poisoning, which we talked about last week, where we could see that pollution does cause these birth defects. Another one in America was the Cuyahoga, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Cuyahoga River fire, which is this river up kind of around the Great Lakes. And it was so polluted that it caught on fire. And it used to do this quite regularly, but there's one big burn in the 1960s. But it just seems to be so illogical that a river catches fire. And so people knew that pollution was so bad that something had to be done about it. So this kind of triggered events which eventually led towards the American Clean Air Act in the 1970s, which was quite a revolutionary Clean Air Act and then copied around the rest of the world. The other big pollution concern was acid rain. And acid rain was important. So how acid rain works is if you're burning coal for your energy production, which most countries were, that coal has sulfur and nitrogen and things in it, which goes up into the air. So you see from the bottom picture, but when it goes in the air, it mixes with water and it comes down as sulfuric acid or well, the other forms of acid there as well. And while this is not dangerous, you know, like it's not like you'd be in an acid rain or anything, but what happens is it kind of settles on trees and it settles on buildings and it gradually kind of etches them away or rots them. And so, you know, forests were facing damage. But the real issue here, as we can see from this map of acid rain in Europe, was that most acid rain was produced in places like United Kingdom, but that would then, most of the pollution was produced in United Kingdom, but that would then blow across into Sweden and Denmark and these countries where they would suffer the consequences. Same was occurring in Germany or in East Germany. And here we see that these countries were burning lots of coal, but then would blow into different directions. And same here with northern Italy as well and France. Now, the big point here was that countries were suffering the consequences of pollution without producing that pollution. So Denmark and Sweden were having acid rain that was caused by England. And this sort of made people realize that pollution is a global thing. It's an international thing. You know, when Denmark and Sweden first said to the UK, your pollution is affecting us, you've got to stop burning coal, they were like, not our problem. You know, we can burn coal, we can do what we like. But gradually there came a realization that there's kind of what we call the polluter pays principle, that if you pollute the environment, you should pay for the consequences. So this began a kind of coordination between the parties at the European level to say we need to kind of coordinate on pollution to make sure our pollution doesn't affect other countries. And this is kind of 70s and 80s, I think, when this was occurring. And the last thing, this occurs alongside the rise of green politics. So Germany was the first country to have a Green Party. But many countries around the world have Green parties, and some of them are quite strong. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, England, France all have their version of the Green parties. And so it starts in the 1970s and becomes much more widespread. Now, while it's still a kind of a fringe party that in most places only like 5 to 10% of the voting population would vote for the Greens, it is a kind of established part of the political area, the political scene. And that we know now that green politics is a major part. And particularly nowadays, we know that all major parties have to have an environmental policy. And that's where we kind of see this connection with environmental policy, that you need to have ideas about human rights and the environment. Okay, so we'll pause the first section there.